Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Midwest and Great Plains Drought Update Webinar. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. Thank you. John Ives, Climate Services Program Manager with the National Weather Service in Kansas City, you may begin your conference.
Thank you, Tiffany, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers for today, Mark Svoboda, who's a climatologist and the Monitoring Program Area Leader at the National Drought Mitigation Center, University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Also, we have with us today Dr. Richard Nelson. He's the coordinator for the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Bismarck, North Dakota. First, Mark will speak on the current situation with the drought, and then we will have a short question and answer period, and that will be followed by Dr. Nelson's presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer period following that. So, without any further ado, Mark, take it away.
All right, thanks, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Let's just jump right into it. As we like to start off with here, acknowledging our partners on the project. As you can see, this is sort of passed around each series of webinar by the partners here from South Dakota State and Central Region, as well as the High Plains Regional Climate Center, Midwest Regional Climate Center, and the state climatologists out there, and Iowa State and the Climate Prediction Center as well. So a good list of collaborators that bring these together for you when we do this. So some of the information is there, and at the end of the talk, we'll provide you some other references that you can dig into a little deeper if you wish to. So what I'd like to cover today, if you heard Brian Fuchs a couple weeks ago, I'll follow the same general outline here of kind of where we are currently. We did have on the eastern fringe of the region what sort of Isaac brought to the table. And we'll look at sort of the forecast situation, the impacts that we've seen, and wrap it up with any Q&A. So this is the recent map that was just released this morning. As you can see, Brian's been on the map the last 2 weeks and had the fun chore of trying to assess the benefits or lack thereof of Isaac and sort of the path it took. Would have liked to have seen that come a little bit more west. We got some of the humidity, didn't get any of the clouds or the rain here in Lincoln. I can speak for that. But you can see there's sort of some improvement there. You can see Brian has put sort of a polygon of the long-term drought around sort of that section of the Midwest from Arkansas up into Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. That was the area where we saw a pretty good marked improvement of the most intense categories, D3 and D4. But you can see there's still some lagging hydrological impacts that will have us consider how fast to bring an area out of drought or not. And we like to be a little conservative until we know, say, groundwater levels have recovered, et cetera. So if you look at this chart and pay attention to the 2 circles in the bottom, this week compared to last, you might think, wow, it didn't change. In fact, the amount of area went up for the United States. And again, that's because of sort of this intensification and expansion on the western fringe. The area on the eastern side, while it did see improvement, it didn't remove the spatial footprint of the drought altogether. So we still have drought remaining there. It's just not as intense. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. When you look at the stats, sometimes they don't tell the whole story. You got to dig a little deeper. But what you do notice is a slight decrease in the total amount in the D3, D4 category for the country. Now, if we zoom in and look at the region here as a whole, here we see a little bit of more obvious improvement in the intense categories that have circled here, D3 and D4, with a decrease there of about 6%, from 44 down to about 38% roughly. What's interesting, again, if you look just at D4, though, is we've had more expansion in parts of the western part of this region, Nebraska, Kansas, et cetera, where the D4 has actually expanded just a tad. So you kind of depends on what time frame you're looking at. This is the complexity and the behavior the drought shows, not not too unexpected, really, when you're kind of showing recovery on one front and yet deterioration on the other. So shifting gears and kind of looking at the current situation, looking at what they're showing for the next week out as far as other hazards are concerned. Looks like drought's still pretty much stealing the show. Not much to show here with Isaac out of the picture. We see still some potential for heavy rains in the Northeast and perhaps Florida, but in general, drought is sort of the flavor of the day or week again. The next slide does show, here we're looking at obviously the path of Isaac up the Gulf and landfall there in Louisiana, Mississippi, working its way up the Mississippi Valley into the Midwest, and brought a lot of good rain, much needed rain, and remarkably so. It was pretty much a slow mover, and outside of where it came on land, as you move north, these were pretty beneficial rains all in all. I mean, we didn't see a lot of concern or a lot of damage due to flooding when you got north up here. So those soils are ready to soak it up. It was still pretty heavy in places, but didn't come all at once, really intensely, such that we lost a lot of that to runoff. This was still about what the best news we could have got from the doctor, and just what we needed. So very good indeed. We also saw a relief from the heat, especially in the eastern part of the belt here of the region, for central region. And you can see that along with the rains and cloud cover brought some moderation of temperatures. There's still sort of a little stubborn heat in the western part of the region here, and in the Dakotas, Nebraska, western Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming. However, all in all, we're not seeing those bright reds that we've seen earlier this summer, where we were 6 to 10 or even more degrees above normal, not just for weeks on end, but months on end, it seems. And this still shows you, though, we're still looking at the demand side of this, looking at temperatures now from January 1 to present, using the ASIS system here out of the Regional Climate Center feed. It's pretty much wall-to-wall above normal temperatures, and for a sustained period of time like this, this is what's put us in the fix from a soil moisture drawdown standpoint. More specifically, just kind of tying in on a product we got from USDA here, looking at the number of 100-degree days between, just in the summer period here, June through the end of August. And you can see that, if you recall, last year this was the real story down in the southeast and in the southern plains region, and we saw this bubble sort of expand northward as the soils dried out, associated with 2 heat waves both in June and July. A lot of days of 100-degree heat. Many of these days here marked by almost a month of that sort of weather in the darkest purple there, where you're getting 30 days or more. And so that had a significant role in exacerbating the drought and the impacts, both from an intensity standpoint and I think certainly in how fast this drought developed in this region. We knew it was down to the south of us from the year prior in 2011, the drought in the southeast and the southern plains. And while with the second consecutive La Nina winter, you might have anticipated the southern tier states still continuing to be dry. I don't think anyone was really expecting how fast. When you looked at the seasonal drought outlooks or the seasonal outlooks, even as of late as mid-June, they were not showing that expansion into the corn and bean belt. Looking at a couple time frames here, again, to look at the short term versus the long term, and where do we see improvement, and where should we really still be a little bit concerned coming into the drier fall season, as we've reached our apex for precipitation maximum for a good deal of this region. The last 30 days have still been extremely dry in the western part of the region. So we're still seeing well below normal. You can see definitely the role that Isaac played in the 30-day picture for improvement in parts of Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. But even then, we'll see as we get into the longer-term picture, there's still some deficits there for most, if not all. There's a small area there in Illinois that you'll see later on that might actually show some above normal for a longer period of time. But for the most part, this didn't erase everything with regards to drought. It just helped a lot. And it came too late to really help us for corn. It certainly helps to get this in the in the safety deposit, if you will, for sort of a security blanket. We need to recharge the soil profile going into next growing season. Pasture and rains, and those grasses don't come back overnight, so we need that moisture now to get us through the winter. Looking at the 30-day SPI, still shows that pronounced dryness. South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. I think you can see here, in fact, in Lincoln for the July-August period, just that 2-month period, the driest 2-month period, drier than any period we've seen ever, including the Dust Bowl years. So obviously this isn't an event like that. We're not talking a multi-year drought at this point. We're talking a multi-seasonal drought. There's plenty of time to hit the reset button and calm some fears out there, as this isn't year 2 or 3 at this point, especially with perhaps a transition to El Nino instead of La Nina in the upcoming winter months, which I'll show here a little bit later on. Going back now 90 days instead of 30 days. Now you see a lot of that short-term wetness go away, except, as I mentioned, sort of in south-central Illinois. The rest of the region, except for some pockets in maybe central North Dakota, and as I mentioned, Illinois, and maybe perhaps northwest Indiana, you can see the deficits are still there. The impacts have occurred. You're not going to get that back. Soybeans, it could have helped a little bit, certainly for lawns and gardens. But when you look at the longer-term drought perspective, we still have reason to say this drought is not over. And the 90-day SPI reflects that same picture, but puts it in more of a historical context. When you're getting down to -1.5, -2, that's a significant dry period in relationship to the history of the sites that are going into the ACES database. So we're seeing some significant dryness still throughout a good chunk of this region. Just focusing on the growing season only, you can still see outside of that little blip there in south central Illinois that's circled, most of the region, again, outside of parts of Minnesota and North Dakota, everyone else is pretty much been.
Pardon the interruption, Mr. Ayers. I just wanted to let you know that I have been able to locate Mr. Angel's line as well as Dr. Nelson's, and they do now have open lines.
Okay, thank you.
I'll return you to your conference.
Deficits that they had to deal with during the critical time, and drought's all about timing, timing, timing. Year-to-date SPI, well, we have seen a reversal of fortunes along the Gulf Coast region, even before Isaac, even with the La Nina in place. Eastern Texas, for example, unexpectedly saw market improvement heading into the year, which really helped. And perhaps that trend will continue with El Nino, where you expect a cooler, wetter winter across the southern tier states of the U.S. Always a little bit more dicier to make the call for where we are up here in the Midwest and Central Plains. So let's take a look at the outlooks and then the impacts, and we'll wrap it up for Q&A. Looking at the next 5 days, perhaps some more moisture across the southern or eastern portions of the central region, particularly in Missouri, southern Illinois, and Indiana. Not so much in the west. Eastern Kansas, I guess you could throw in that mix as well, but certainly not up in the high plains and the northern plains, where we're still seeing a dry signature there over the next few days. The heat seems to be, we've been pretty zonal lately. We've seen a moderation of that, but now we're seeing maybe a little bit of ridging or heat building back in from the west there in the latter part of that period. And we'll see where that goes by taking a look at the next graphic at 8 to 14 days, where you can see they're in a little bit, it doesn't show here, but just looking at the analysis and listening to the prognostic discussion, not a real strong forecast here. There's a little bit of disagreement as to the zonal trend continuing. But all in all, you can see a greater likelihood of above normal temperature for most of the central region, save for probably perhaps southern Indiana, Illinois. And then looking at precipitation, coupled with that likelihood of above normal temperatures, we see a likelihood of below normal precipitation for most of this region as well. So this stubborn pattern keeps kind of holding on. Fills right back in after Isaac left stage right. Looking out a little farther at the next, the rest of September, and then September through November prior to the winter outlook that will be forecast here a little bit later on in the next month or so, we can see, again, sort of a persistence type of approach here. Above normal temperatures being likely in most of the central region, and the dry signal being mostly contained to the upper Great Lakes, eastern Dakotas, and perhaps northeastern Nebraska, and perhaps a little bit of a chance for being above normal on the eastern side of the region in Indiana, Illinois, which would continue to help them recharge heading into next spring. So that would be welcomed if it bears true. Looking at September through November, equal chances on the precip, no big shocker there. We're transitioning likely into El Nino. We'll take a look at some graphics. The temperature component, however, they seem a little bit more sure about, and looking at showing the likelihood of persistence in above normal temperatures region-wide, particularly in the upper Great Lakes region. Here we're looking at the plume for the ENSO forecast here moving forward. This is as of mid-August. The next graphic will kind of give you an update to that. Pretty good spread there as to how intense this event may or may not be, but you can see a pretty good consensus as far as all of them being above the line, so you're not seeing very good odds at all of persisting with a La Nina type of winter, which is good news, I think, overall. But again, doesn't give us a lot of strength of idea of intensity, nor will it tell us where the jet sets up and what sort of storm tracks we get during the late fall into winter period that may or may not bring relief to more of the western part of the region in absence of us getting any relief out of Isaac. The next graphic shows that likelihood, the El Nino in red, those bars, a 70% likelihood there, looking at that developing over the late fall, early winter period and persisting into early next year, with neutral sort of lagging in there, coming on later on as El Nino were to wane off. And most importantly, I think you can see the small blue bars there that represent the likelihood of La Nina coming into play is very, very slim to none down there. Still a slight chance, but not a good chance. So hopefully this will signal a reversal of our atmospheric misfortunes and make them more fortunate. We'll see. The seasonal drought outlook, hot off the presses, is showing, again, off of that, sort of what you saw there. Perhaps some improvement continuing on the eastern part of the central region. However, a lot of persistence in the dry conditions we're seeing in the western part of the region down into the southern plains. So this is showing that picture moving forward over the next 3 months, ending the end of November. The only place where they're showing any sort of development is in Hawaii at this point over this time frame. Okay, so what kind of impacts have been reported? As you may or may not know, we maintain the Drought Impact Reporter here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. And that database has been populated since 2005. And this year alone, we're close to nearly, well, this only goes through the end of August. So as of now, we're over 4,000 impacts that have been reported, or 4,000 reports, I should say. And the breakdown you can see is predominantly has been for agriculture, but as the drought has persisted on, we've seen more and more communities go into either voluntary or mandatory water restrictions. So that's been the story as of late, whereas fire was the story early on in the western part of this region. And then looking at the states most impacted, of course, all of those aren't in central region, but several of those are. In fact, when you look at the bottom there at Iowa, 323 reports, Nebraska was about the same. So there's quite a few of those central region states, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, that have been severely impacted in many sectors. And we'd love to see some recovery over the winter here to kind of set that reset button for us come 2013. And the last thing I'll show here before wrapping it up is one thing we've done. I think it's been a great effort out there, and many of you folks know through your co-op network, and many of you are also involved with CocoRAS. I know the state climatologists in particular are, and even some of the Weather Service folks. We worked with CocoRAS to develop a direct conduit and an interface within the CocoRAS interface to enter in drought impacts. And that has just helped tremendously, sort of that citizen science effort to people to upload photos to show how drought's impacting them at the local level. So I think I wanted to make people aware that it's been working, and our partnership with you folks and with Cocoa Raws has resulted in a huge increase of volunteer submission of impacts. So kudos to you all for that. Okay, the other impact, of course, the big story has been the drought in corn. And when Brian last gave the update as of July 11th, you could see they had just cut their production yield estimates by 12% down to 12.97 billion bushels. A month later, the most recent numbers off some of the actual field surveys at this point in August, they cut it another 17% nearly, another 2.17 billion bushels, down to a total of 10.8 billion bushels. So the corn crop really took a beating off of this drought. And the graphic in the bottom right just shows the swelling of the number of counties as drought disaster declarations by the Secretary of Agriculture just due to drought alone. Now, this shows how that peaked up and ramped up into late July, sort of plateaued off there in August and is coming down. But again, pretty much too late to do much good. If that had happened a month ago, there might have been something worth salvaging, but not really at this point. And here's the information that you'll typically see each week. So there's plenty of great information there with the variety of collaborators to go find maybe what I didn't touch on in good enough detail for you or something piqued your interest. Please follow up or send me an email. And with that, John, I'll wrap it up and ask if there are any questions we can help them with. Thanks.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, press star followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Again, that is star 1 on your telephone keypad to ask a question. There are no questions in queue at this time. My apologies, we have a question from the line of Wichita. Your line is open.
Yes, we wanted to make sure that this presentation would be available in PDF form so we could gather some of those links that Mark provided at the end.
This is John. Yes, it will be available to you immediately following the webinar today.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
There are no further questions in queue at this time. I turn the conference back over to our presenters.
Well, thank you, Mark, very much for giving us the updated briefing on the drought. We sure appreciate it. And if you have any questions, we'll send out the information following this call on where the presentations themselves will be, plus the recording for this call. Okay, thank you. We'll move along now and move to introduce from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Rick Nelson. Rick, I'm going to make you the presenter, and you can, as soon as you're ready, you can begin.
Are you opening my presentation, John, or am I doing that from here?
You're doing it from there.
Okay, hang on just a second.
Okay. You should have just received a little pop-up that says, would you like to be the presenter?
Okay. Can you see is it showing up now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Rick Nelson. I'm with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm in Bismarck, North Dakota. When Doug Cluck asked me to give a presentation on drought and the impacts on fish and wildlife, I asked him what specifically he thought I should cover, and he just said, well, just talk about drought and fish and wildlife. So what I've done today is I put together a presentation that's going to speak kind of generally to a couple of things. I won't have a lot of data on this particular PowerPoint, but I've titled this thing "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly," partially because last weekend I was kind of laid up with a bad back, and I spent a lot of time watching the American Movie Classics channel, and it happened to be Clint Eastwood Day one day. But in reality, when we think about drought and fish and wildlife, much like when we think about the other end of the spectrum where we have a lot of water, there are good parts, bad parts, and then there are some very, very nasty parts of drought or flood. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of examples. And, of course, drought and flooding, changes in conditions affect different species differently. And of course, if you're mobile, you can deal with things better than if you're not mobile. And so the impacts of drought on fish and wildlife really depend upon kind of looking at individual species in many cases to determine what those impacts may or may not be. So just to get started, I'm the coordinator for the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC, and you can see the geographic boundary. There are 21 other LCCs, landscape conservation cooperatives in the country, and I butt up against those. And so I'm going to talk today about examples that really fit for the northern Great Plains and this geographic area. But as Mark just mentioned and showed several slides, this drought is widespread, and many of these same issues for wildlife and fish species occur throughout that area, and not just within the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC. The line on the map, by the way, is meant to be just a designation, but we consider these boundaries to be fuzzy. So I work closely with folks in the LCC surrounding me on fish and wildlife issues, not just within this geographic area. So let's take a look at a couple of things. Whoops. How do I go back one? All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about wetlands, because in the Dakotas, certainly in Nebraska with the Playa Lakes and throughout other parts of the region, prairie wetlands are an incredibly important resource for a number of species. Probably the most well-known are migratory waterfowl, but there are other migratory birds. Resident wildlife are also highly dependent upon prairie wetlands. And of course, we've had an extensive drainage of prairie wetlands. We still have quite a few left, at least in North Dakota. Other parts of the traditional prairie pothole region have been extensively drained for agricultural purposes. But the point I want to make here is a couple of things. The important part about prairie wetlands is that these are complexes of different types of wetlands. And in this particular picture, you can see wetlands of all different shapes and sizes. And I don't know, can you guys see my pointer moving or not?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so the ones up here in the far upper corner are big, huge, probably permanent wetlands that have water, probably even in very severe droughts. But one of the things that we do see that happens in droughts, and we're seeing that this year in North Dakota, even though, if you recall, the maps Mark showed, North Dakota and parts of South Dakota aren't as dry as other areas. But we've come off 3 really, really wet years. And what we've seen in the wet years is many of these same wetland basins, and you can see the outline of this one, they're actually what I would call overfull. They're full to the brim and in some cases overflowing. For a lot of migratory waterfowl species, this complex is incredibly important because these smaller wetlands, particularly in the spring, provide habitats because they thaw early. They're full of invertebrate species, and birds key in on those pretty rapidly. When we have a drought like we're having now, that kind of started earlier this summer, many of these dry up sooner than they would in a, quote, normal year, whatever normal may look like. Well, that's an important impact for birds that, ducks, for example, that may renest. If they lose an initial nest, many species will renest. But if these smaller wetland basins are not available, those renesting attempts either don't take place or they aren't successful, because that's where the hens usually take the ducklings initially for food supply. As drought increases in intensity, then some of these other wetland complexes become drier. And so even some of the ones like these larger semi-permanent wetlands will become dry, probably much sooner than they would have been in what we would consider a normal year. So that's a negative part of the drought. That's a bad part. Certainly for resident wildlife species, when those things dry up, then they need to find different habitats. But one of the beneficial aspects of drought, you know, assuming that it doesn't go too long, is that it also causes some of these larger wetlands, like the ones in the upper part of the screen, to draw down and dry up, and then the rest of these will be dry as well. And that's an important aspect of prairie wetland ecology, because drought here is a positive in the sense that when those wetland basins dry and those soils dry out, it allows aeration of the soils, and it allows, when those things reflood, to really release a lot of nutrients into the water column. And then we get these huge blooms of aquatic invertebrates. So these wetlands become productive almost overnight when we go from a drought to a deluge situation. The benefit to these larger areas, like the ones up here, these tend to be very, very saline wetlands. But during the course of more severe droughts, these things will dry down as well. And when the wind blows, it actually blows the salts out of the basin, so that when those fill up the next time, they are also much fresher than they were originally. So drought indeed can have some negative impacts, but from a wetland perspective, there are benefits to these systems drying out occasionally. And of course, we're drying out now, not as severely as we did years ago in the drought of the late 80s and early 90s, but we are seeing some drying of wetland basins at this time. So here's a picture of kind of a similar situation during what would be considered probably a more dry condition. And what you see are these large, more permanent bodies of water, and some of the smaller basins are gone. And so in this agricultural field, for example, you can see where there's some drainage that has gone on here, and there are some areas in here that were, in a wetter year, probably wetland basins that no longer exist. When we think about drought and wildlife, of course, most folks think about drought in terms of agriculture, I suspect, but we try to think about drought for wildlife in the context of hydrologic drought, because on the prairies especially, and not just prairie wetlands, but many of our rivers and streams, we think more about hydrologic drought than agricultural drought, although certainly many species of wildlife depend upon domesticated crops for part of their food needs during the course of their life cycle. And so when we get into heavy agricultural types of droughts like we're seeing now, and those human food sources are in trouble, many species of wildlife that depend upon those have some problems as well. And that goes up here as well, where we've traditionally seen mostly small grains, which are incredibly important crops for migratory waterfowl, for example, but for resident species as well. When those things aren't there, then if you can move, you do leave. So we often see in the fall, if the crops aren't doing well up here due to drought, that migratory waterfowl just don't stay here very long. Resident species have a little tougher time of it. And then one of the bad parts about those droughts, and the ugly part, is that often puts humans in conflict with wildlife. So when it gets dry and hay supplies are in short supply, we often get a lot of pressure within the Fish and Wildlife Service to open up areas to haying and grazing. Certainly CRP lands are opened up to provide hay for farmers and ranchers. So we can get into those types of conflicts as well during drought situations. Here's a picture that I took off someplace I can't remember, but the other negative aspect of drought is, again, that it provides opportunities for the agricultural community to do something that, of course, we in the wetlands world don't really appreciate, and that is drainage. So when it's dry, there is an additional incentive to drain wetlands, because it's very easy to put in drains when those wetlands are dry versus when they aren't dry. So here's a couple of pictures from South Dakota showing some drainage and tile drainage, pattern tile drainage we call it. You can see the drain lines that have been put into this particular wetland when it was dry. And of course, when water returns to that landscape, that wetland system will no longer be there due to drainage. Another picture from South Dakota, same thing. This is a very large, or was a very large semi-permanent wetland. You can see the drain lines in that wetland, and that field will now be plowed and planted next time there's a planting season. So drought can be a benefit to the agricultural community who's interested in getting the landscape a little drier for the next time. But certainly from a wildlife perspective, that's not necessarily a good deal to have happen. And of course, that drainage stuff is very difficult to do when it's wet. It's very expensive to do when it's wet. But when it's dry, it can be done very quickly and very easily. You probably saw the headline. I'm going to switch to fish a little bit here. And again, going back to hydrology and hydrologic droughts, of course, rivers are impacted by drought. And Mark showed a slide showing some water supply numbers. Of course, their rivers are important for that, but they're also important for fish habitat and for recreational uses. So earlier this summer, Yellowstone Park closed 3 rivers in the park because of low water conditions and high water temperatures that were potentially going to negatively impact the trout species in those rivers. And of course, rainbow trout aren't necessarily native to that part of the world, but trout, for example, do not handle very warm water temperatures. So when the water temperature begins to rise, we start to see some direct effects, but also some indirect effects on aquatic communities. So warm water temperatures are certainly a stressor to those critters that live in water. It may not be a direct mortality that we see occurring because of increased water temperatures or decreased flows, but what we can see, and we often do see, are physiological impacts. The stresses put on aquatic organisms because of reduced flows or increased temperatures often cause issues for immune responses. And so we often find fish that are stressed in those systems to have lesions that would not normally occur, bacterial infections. We do see outbreaks of diseases in fish species in many of these systems that are directly related to the increased water temperatures due to low flows for drought, and the high temperatures certainly we've had this summer have exacerbated that. Not all fish obviously succumb to those, but certainly it impacts their ability to effectively reproduce, and in some cases it kills them. And so here's another headline from the paper that you may have seen. This one is particularly interesting from an ecological perspective because shovel-nosed sturgeon are native species, and they are warm water fish. And so they have evolved in stream systems with warmer water temperatures, certainly than rainbow trout, which are submonads and need cold water. Sturgeon live in rivers like the Missouri and the tributaries to the Missouri, where they're used to turbid warm water. But in Iowa this year, with the lack of rain and the low runoff and low stream conditions and increased temperature, we lost 40,000 shovel-nosed sturgeon in Iowa, directly due to the fact that the temperatures were really warm, stream temperatures of 100 degrees, low flows, a whole host of those things that impacted sturgeon. And these critters evolved with warmer temperatures. Now I've lost the PowerPoint for some reason. There we go. Thank you. So the impacts can be not just to species that may not be native to a particular environment, but we've seen, and not just shovel-nosed sturgeon in North Dakota, for example, in the James River, we saw a fairly large die-off of northern pike this year because of the drought conditions, the low water levels, and the very high temperatures we had this summer. Many of the stream systems we have in the Great Plains are what we refer to as intermittent streams, and here's an example of one. And species that utilize these systems, again, have evolved to take advantage of the water when it's there. And they've also evolved mechanisms to deal with the fact that sometimes there isn't water. When we get into very severe droughts, what we see happening in these intermittent streams is not only do they dry up like they would normally do in the course of the year, but more so, they dry and extend such that any of the refugia that would be there in what we would consider a normal year, we also lose. So we can lose large sections of these intermittent streams during a severe drought that really impact the species that live there, because those pool areas that they could normally get through in tough times, if the drought lasts too long, those disappear. And a number of species that actually would be able to weather a drought by burrowing into the mud, for example, during extended drought periods, it gets too dry for them as well, and they don't make it. So the changes that we see in the intermittent streams can have long-term effects during drought, because these areas are not only places where organisms live, but many species use these streams for spawning. And so even though the main river channel may have plenty of water, the areas that fish go to either spawn or to feed heavily after spawning may or may not be there, particularly in an extended long-term drought. And of course, here's a good shot from the plains, and back to the fact that these are also important for agricultural production. And we see this here often, that many of these small intermittent streams that ranchers either dam up or utilize for water sources for their cattle disappear. That also causes not only ranchers to have to move their cattle, but it causes wildlife species that normally depend on those intermittent streams to have to disperse as well. So we do see oftentimes during droughts movement patterns in wildlife that wouldn't necessarily occur if there was water sources available. This is a shot of one of our waterfowl production areas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has thousands of waterfowl production areas across the northern Great Plains that are purchased with duck stamp money and basically are used to raise waterfowl. And one of the management techniques that we utilize to maintain those habitats in a productive state is, of course, prescribed fire. So during a drought situation, we run into several problems that impact wildlife. If we have a burn planned, we want to carry it out within that very short window that conditions are right. But during drought, we often cannot do that. In fact, right now in North Dakota, it's getting dry enough that the governor has just kind of declared an emergency, and although burns are still allowed, they're being done with very, very much caution. So when we're in a drought, even a short-term drought like now, if we wanted to do a fall burning this year, it'd be very difficult probably to pull that off because it is so very dry. The impact of that on wildlife is, again, direct and indirect in the sense that many of these burns are done to help us control non-native invasive species like Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome. And someone might ask, well, so you can't burn this year, just do it next year. And sometimes that works, but we usually try to do these burns in a rotational manner such that we can keep ahead of those invasive species. They're very, very difficult to get rid of. The other aspect of fire management and burning is, of course, fire is not necessarily fire. We want to have those fires be a certain duration, a certain temperature, move at a certain speed. And during drought conditions, of course, we may not get the desired result. We may have material too dry, it burns too hot, too fast to do the job that we really want it to do. And so those areas that cannot be burned, and the other aspect of management that we do is grazing, and in some cases, if it's too dry, we can't graze those areas either. So our management capabilities are often affected by even short-term droughts, and certainly in long-term droughts, definitely impacted by our ability to do land management activities on the lands that we manage. And the same goes for the private lands that make up the majority of the northern Great Plains. Those management options are limited by the lack of precipitation, the lack of water, and the lack of good groundwater sources. And of course, from a recreational perspective, we're moving into our hunting season now, but certainly fishing opportunities can be affected. And this is a picture, I think, from somewhere in Indiana. Of course, if you own one of these boats, you've got a much different situation from a recreational perspective than you would have in a normal year. But I threw this slide in also, again, to make the case about the benefit of drought in many aquatic systems that we have up here. And you can see the cracks in the soil. That's what occurs in our wetland systems when it dries out, and that's the benefit of the drought in terms of regenerating nutrients. When this system, this is a lake obviously, but lakes work the same way. When this system refills, the nutrients that have been built up in those anaerobic sediments will be released into the water column, and there'll be a huge bloom of invertebrates that will be beneficial to the organisms that ultimately return to that system. But if you're a boat owner, if you're a water skier or a fisherman and your lake is dry, obviously that's a huge impact to you. And of course, if you happen to have been the fish that lived in this system, not likely you moved anywhere. And so we do see local extinctions often occur during droughts. So just quick in summary, again, the good, the bad, the ugly. Drought's not all bad. We do see benefits over the course of time, and certainly prairie wetland systems and the intermittent streams we have up here. And even the Missouri River, for example, pre-dam, evolved during conditions of drought and deluge, and those organisms that live there have evolved with those conditions. So there are some positive aspects of short-duration droughts, too long-term, and then we start to see negative things like local extinction, serious loss of habitats. In the case of the conversion of our ag community up here from traditional small grains to corn and beans, we're seeing way more drainage going on now than we did, and drought can exacerbate that. Invasive species can become a more of a problem during droughts because we can't manage for those as effectively, and in some cases they outcompete many of the natives when things get too bad. And then the last one, I guess, that I wanted to highlight, and this is really the human dimensions aspect of all of this, because folks will say, well, it gets dry and the big impact is to people. Well, that carries over into ecological aspects as well, because we often find that during droughts, the ecological impacts we see come head-to-head with impacts on people. And we never like to get into the situation where we're talking about a competition between wildlife and people, because, of course, the needs of people will come first. But this is the ugly part. We often see political aspects and economic aspects kind of overwhelming the impacts of ecological droughts. So, and I'm not saying this is good or it's bad. It's just the way it is. And obviously it will be that way, again, because of the benefit to people. So an example would be this fall. North Dakota is already talking about limiting hunting opportunities in the western part of the state because it is indeed so dry. Well, that's a sociological impact. If you like to hunt out in the western part of the state, your opportunities might be somewhat limited. But from an ecological perspective, when we have to make decisions among competing uses for things, and wildlife usually comes second, and again, that's not a commentary on good or bad, it's the way that it is. Oftentimes, those ecological impacts are exacerbated by some of the socioeconomic decisions we make. So when we open up CRP, for example, to haying and grazing, which up here this year is a necessity, our hay crops aren't that good, that habitat base that was there for wildlife certainly is markedly changed from what it would be during more wet conditions. So with that, I'll see if there's any questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today.
To ask a question at this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to do so, press star followed by the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Again, that is star 1 on your telephone keypad to ask a question. Your first question comes from the line of Greg Schuler. Your line is open.
Hi. Wondering what you could say about the kinds of winter conditions and impacts of wildlife, if you could kind of sketch out scenarios given what it kind of looks like here in early September as far as what we might be heading into.
Sure. Well, we've come off 3 really, really bad winters. So when Mark talked about La Nina switching to El Nino, I was doing this little happy dance because we've had 3 really nasty winters. And, of course, the impacts of those on wildlife is horrendous. For example, just in North Dakota, we went from a huge deer herd to one in which we had 150,000 deer licenses 2 years ago. This year we have 65,000 licenses available. So those winter conditions really negatively impacted the numbers. And the other part of that is that became a very quickly one of those ugly parts of drought or deluge, because depredation problems became a huge issue. And even though we had a lot of wet conditions and you would have thought we had good food supplies up here in terms of hay, we really didn't. So farmers and ranchers in this part of the world were having problems with deer depredation. Now, the good news for wildlife in general, though, is given a drought or severe winters like we've had, there are some advantages to having it drier. Obviously, you can move around better in a winter when it's more open than it was. And last year we had a very open winter. Even native species like sharp-tailed grouse that have evolved with snow have a hard time in really, really heavy snow. So the conditions that look like we're getting into this year are probably going to be overall beneficial to resident populations, certainly the migratory organisms leave. The downside is, though, if it continues dry and we get into another dry winter and spring like we had last year, when those migratory birds, for example, come back, they're going to find a much smaller population of available wetlands to use for pre-nesting food sources. And so we'll see some impacts probably to that, coupled with the fact that we're losing huge amounts of grass from CRP conversion. So dry conditions, again, have some benefits for resident species especially, but can have some negative impacts for those organisms that return in the spring.
To There are no further questions in queue at this time. I turn the conference back over to our presenters.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. We sure appreciate you being here with us today. As I mentioned earlier, when this is concluded, we will be sending out an email where you can get a copy of the presentations as well as the recording. For Doug Cluck and myself and other state climatologists in the regional climate centers, thank you for joining us today, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
This concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.